Lacambria Toomer first went missing in August of 2022.
He killed the mother of his child and discarded her body so it could never be found.
We did several searches for my daughter. He never contacted me. He never contacted the baby. He did nothing.
Lacambria Toomer went missing after being with her child's father, and evidence later found inside his Audi would become central to a murder case. She was 23, a young mother from Albany, Georgia, with an infant son. But in August 2022, Lacambria disappeared, and her phone's last known ping came from a truck lot on Centennial Avenue. Ryan Cooper, the father of her child and the last person reported to have seen her, told police he had dropped her off at a truck stop in Cordell. Investigators said that story wasn't true. Lacambria's body has never been found, but years later, a jury convicted Cooper of her murder. So what did police find inside that car that helped them prove a murder without ever finding the victim? To understand how investigators eventually reached that car, you have to go back to August 2022, when nobody yet knew that Lacambria's disappearance would become a murder case. At the time, Lacambria was 23 years old. She was the mother of a 6-month-old boy. To her family, she was not a headline. She was Cam, a daughter, a mother, a great-granddaughter who, according to her great-grandmother, had a habit of calling just to check in. "Granny, how you doing?" Those small calls would later matter, because when they suddenly stopped, the silence did not feel normal. Lacambria's mother, Malacia Thornton, would eventually describe the pain of that silence publicly. Her family knew Lacambria sometimes spent long stretches with Ryan Cooper, the father of her baby. Her aunt later explained that they often expected Lacambria to be with the person she was usually around. But Lacambria still contacted people. She still had a baby. And according to her family, disappearing without reaching out was out of character. That is why the timeline surrounding the middle of August matters so much. And it is also where the record has to be handled carefully. Some early public reports listed August 13, 2022, as the date Lacambria was last seen. Her family later said the last Facebook Messenger contact they knew of came on August 14th. Then, during Ryan Cooper's murder trial years later, investigators presented phone evidence extending the timeline into August 15. Those are not the same thing. One is a reported last seen date. One is family contact. And one is electronic activity. But together, they narrowed the final known period of Lacambria Toomer's life to a small window in mid-August 2022. And within that window was Ryan Cooper. Cooper was the father of Lacambria's child. He worked as a truck driver, and by 2022, the relationship between him and Lacambria already had a documented history that prosecutors would later bring before a jury. That history included testimony about a frightening incident from the year before Lacambria disappeared. In court, the owner of an Albany beauty salon described a young woman suddenly appearing outside her business. It was Lacambria. The salon owner testified that Lacambria was wearing a bra, tights, and only one shoe. She was banging on the locked door. According to the witness, Lacambria was screaming, "Let me in! Let me in!" The salon owner told the jury she thought about her own daughters, and she opened the door. When prosecutors asked what Lacambria had said, the woman testified that Lacambria told her she was running from her boyfriend. Lacambria's mother also testified about that incident. According to Thornton, Cooper had told her that Lacambria had jumped out of a car somewhere in Albany. Thornton said she rode with Cooper while they looked for her. When Thornton eventually saw her daughter at the salon, she testified that Lacambria was bleeding and that her clothing was torn. Then, according to Thornton's testimony, Lacambria said Cooper had pointed a gun at her. That was her mother's testimony. It was not something the jury had to imagine, and prosecutors would later use that earlier incident as part of their attempt to show the history between Lacambria and Cooper before she disappeared. There were other alleged domestic incidents presented in court as well. One witness, a friend of Thornton's named Gertrude Sanders, testified about another confrontation. Sanders said Lacambria had told her that she needed help and that Cooper was going to kill her. Those allegations became part of the evidence jurors heard years later. But in August 2022, there was no murder trial. There was no jury. There was no conviction. There was only a young mother who suddenly stopped appearing, and a family slowly realizing that something was wrong. The last days are difficult to reconstruct perfectly, because there is no surviving video showing everything Lacambria did. There is no complete eyewitness account of her final hours. But investigators eventually pieced together portions of that period through witnesses, phone records, location data, and Cooper's own statements. On August 15th, Lacambria was with Cooper. Two other people also became important to investigators: Cooper's longtime friend Tevin Davis and a woman named Catherine Hall. At trial, the witnesses did not agree on every detail of what happened before Lacambria and Cooper left. Hall testified that there had been an altercation between the two. Davis initially testified that he did not witness an altercation before they left. That conflict matters, because this case would eventually depend heavily on separating what people remembered, what people claimed, and what the physical evidence could actually establish. What was not in dispute was that Lacambria left. After that, her trail became harder to follow, and the man investigators would question about where she went next was Ryan Cooper. Months after Lacambria disappeared, Albany Police Lieutenant Calandria Peterson interviewed him. The recording of that interrogation would eventually be played for a jury. Cooper offered an explanation for the last time he said he saw Lacambria. According to Cooper, he and Lacambria were traveling from Albany toward Savannah in connection with his trucking work. They stopped in Cordele, Georgia. Cooper said the two argued. He told investigators Lacambria was upset because she believed he was communicating with other women. According to his account, she got out with a bag containing her belongings. Cooper said he was concerned about getting to a delivery in Savannah on time. So, he said, he left Lacambria at a Love's truck stop in Cordele. Then came a detail that investigators could test. Cooper said that after driving away, he called Lacambria. According to him, she was still upset. She hung up, and that, Cooper said, was the last time he ever heard from her. If that account were true, it offered investigators a clear sequence: a trip, an argument, a truck stop, a phone call, then separation. But investigators had something Cooper could not control: the records. Lieutenant Peterson went through the phone data, and when she later testified about what she found, one part of Cooper's account immediately ran into a problem. Peterson told the jury she found no phone call between Cooper and Lacambria matching the communication he had described. She said she saw no incoming or outgoing calls between them and no texts between their phones in the records she reviewed. The call Cooper said happened after he left her at the truck stop was not there. That did not tell police where Lacambria was, but it gave them a reason to question the story about where Cooper said he had left her. And then investigators looked at location data, because Lacambria's phone had left another trail. Her phone's last known ping came on the night of August 15th. But it did not place her at the Cordele truck stop where Cooper said he had left her. According to Peterson's trial testimony, the phone last pinged at a truck lot on Centennial Avenue. In Albany, the city Lacambria had supposedly already left behind. That was a major contradiction. Cooper's account pointed investigators toward Cordele. The phone pointed back toward Albany. And now police had to consider a far more troubling possibility. If Lacambria had not been left at the Love's truck stop the way Cooper described, where had she actually gone? And why had her phone stopped communicating? Investigators went to the Centennial Avenue area. Peterson later described teams splitting up around the truck lot. There was a large wooded area nearby. They searched it. They searched other locations connected to the phone data: Clark, Broadway, other areas around Albany. They looked for anything that might explain where Lacambria had gone. But search after search ended the same way. No Lacambria, no remains, no answer. And while police were beginning to reconstruct those final movements, Lacambria's family was living a very different version of the same investigation. They did not have phone mapping software. They did not have subpoenas or forensic labs. They had photographs, a missing person flyer, a telephone, and the hope that somebody, somewhere, had seen her. The fact that Lacambria was not formally reported missing until days after the earliest last seen date made everything more difficult. Later reporting would describe an 11-day gap between the publicly reported August 13 last seen date and the missing person report. 11 days. By the time the alarm was formally raised, investigators were not dealing with the first few hours of a disappearance. They were already looking backward. Places had changed. People had moved. Memories had begun to age. and there was still no clear explanation for where Lacambria had gone. Her family began speaking publicly. In September 2022, nearly 4 weeks after the period when Lacambria disappeared, her mother and aunt pleaded for information. Her mother's request was simple: "I just want to hear her voice." At that stage, the family was still asking for Lacambria to come home safely. They did not have a body. They did not have an official explanation for what had happened. And they did not have the certainty that a jury would reach years later. They had absence. Lacambria's aunt explained why that absence frightened them. Lacambria had a 6-month-old son. Even if she did not speak to everybody every day, her family said it was unusual for her to go completely silent. The weeks continued, then the months, and eventually Lacambria's mother began saying publicly what she feared. She believed something had happened to her daughter. She pointed to the history between Lacambria and Cooper. She said that on August 15th, Lacambria had been with the father of her child. Then, according to her, nobody heard from Lacambria again. At one public appeal, Thornton struggled through tears as she asked anyone with information to come forward. "If you are out there, I want you to know that we love you and we want you to come home." She spoke about Lacambria's baby. She spoke about the family waiting for her. And then she addressed whoever might know something about the disappearance. She asked them to have a heart, to come forward, to help bring her daughter home. There was still a possibility, however small, that somebody might provide the piece of information the family needed. A sighting, a location, a person who had seen something. But nothing brought Lacambria home. Her mother kept searching. She would later describe going into wooded areas herself, going into water, going to places she admitted she had no business going. Not because she knew Lacambria was there, but because the alternative was sitting still while her daughter remained missing. Meanwhile, investigators kept returning to the last known people and places in Lacambria's timeline. Ryan Cooper remained central, and his explanation remained a problem. The truck stop story did not fit the phone evidence investigators said they had obtained. The call he claimed to have made was not reflected in the records Peterson reviewed. And Lacambria's last phone location put her in Albany, not at the place Cooper said he had left her. During his recorded interrogation, Cooper denied having anything to do with her disappearance. He told Peterson, "I drive my truck. I got a career and a life." He questioned why he would want to hurt somebody and destroy both that person's future and his own. He pointed out that he had a son. He said Lacambria's mother knew he had tried to help. Investigators listened. Then, they kept checking. They asked about Lacambria's EBT card. They asked about Cooper's work truck. They asked about his personal vehicle. Because by then, the investigation was no longer only about what Cooper said. It was about whether the physical record agreed with him. And that distinction would become the backbone of the entire case. A person can remember something incorrectly. A witness can contradict another witness. A suspect can deny an allegation, but phone records exist independently. Location data exists independently. And physical evidence can sometimes preserve information long after the people involved stop talking. Still, there was an enormous problem. Police had no body. Lacambria had disappeared, but disappearance alone does not prove murder. There was no known eyewitness who could testify that they watched Cooper kill her. There was no confession. And there was no recovered weapon publicly tying him to a killing at that point in the investigation. There was only a missing 23-year-old mother, a disputed timeline, a story investigators said did not match the records, and a phone that had gone silent in Albany. For Lacambria's family, every day without an answer created another painful possibility. Was she somewhere unable to contact them? Had someone harmed her? Could she still come home? Her mother kept speaking directly to the public. Months after the disappearance, she said she did not want Lacambria's young son growing up believing his mother had simply abandoned him. That is not true, she said. She wanted answers for herself. But she also wanted them for Lacambria's child. The baby at the center of this family had lost access to his mother without any explanation. And the man investigators believed was the last person with Lacambria was his father. As Mother's Day approached in 2023, Thornton again appealed for information. By then, Lacambria had been gone for months. Thornton said 8 months was enough. She asked anyone who knew something to speak up. And eventually, she addressed Cooper directly. "Tell me something, Mr. Cooper." She said only he could clear things up. If he was hiding nothing, she wanted him to come forward and explain what he knew. But no explanation brought Lacambria back. And police were reaching a point where looking for Lacambria and investigating what might have happened to her were becoming two different tasks. The phone data had taken them to locations. Those searches had failed to find her. Cooper's account had given them a truck stop. That account had not held up against the records investigators examined. The people around Lacambria and Cooper had given investigators pieces of their relationship and pieces of the final day they were seen together. But there was still no body. If investigators were going to determine whether a crime had occurred, they needed something more than a suspicious story. They needed physical evidence. And that brought them back to one object that had been part of Cooper's life during the period surrounding Lacambria's disappearance. His personal car, a black Audi convertible. Investigators began processing it. Not because a vehicle could tell them everything that had happened. It could not tell them where Lacambria was. It could not explain why she had disappeared. It could not answer her mother's most painful question. But a car can hold traces, on fabric, on a seat, above the passenger compartment. In places someone might overlook. By then, weeks and months of uncertainty had already surrounded Lacambria's disappearance. Her family had searched. Police had followed the phone. Cooper had given his explanation. And Lacambria was still nowhere to be found. Then investigators started looking inside the Audi, and the case changed. The Audi did not give investigators Lacambria, but it gave them something they could test. Crime scene investigators examined parts of Ryan Cooper's black Audi convertible. The vehicle prosecutors would later argue had been the scene of Lacambria's killing. And inside that car, investigators found suspected blood, not on one random surface. Evidence taken from the vehicle included material from the headliner, the passenger seat area, and other parts of the interior. Albany police performed preliminary testing. Then evidence was sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for further analysis. The two stages of testing would later become the subject of intense arguments in court. Because this was not a case where police could simply point to a body, an autopsy, and a cause of death. Everything mattered. How the evidence was collected, how it was tested, where it was found, and most importantly, whose DNA was present. A GBI forensic scientist later testified that DNA recovered from suspected blood in the vehicle was consistent with a biological child of Lacambria's mother. In other words, the genetic evidence pointed back to Lacambria's family line. For prosecutors, that transformed the Audi from simply Cooper's personal vehicle into a crucial piece of the case. But the defense would later challenge the testing. The Albany police testing and the GBI testing did not produce identical results across every item examined, and Cooper's attorneys would use those differences to argue that the forensic picture was less certain than prosecutors claimed. That distinction is important. The jury was not presented with a perfect forensic story where every test produced exactly the same answer. They were presented with evidence. And then they were asked to decide what that evidence meant. Investigators kept looking. One part of the car drew particular attention, the passenger side. Court filings before the trial described what prosecutors characterized as a bullet hole in the vehicle. At trial, an Albany police crime scene investigator showed jurors pieces of the Audi and described a hole or defect around the passenger side door area. But investigators still had no recovered body to compare against the car. No autopsy report. No medical examiner who had examined Lacambria's remains. No recovered remains at all. That left a question at the center of the investigation. Could the physical evidence inside one vehicle establish not only that Lacambria had been hurt there, but that she had died there? Before experts would try to answer that question, investigators heard something else. Something from a person close to Cooper. Tevin Davis had known Ryan Cooper for years. He was described during the trial as Cooper's best friend. That made what Davis told police especially important. Jurors eventually heard a recording of Davis being interviewed by Lieutenant Calandria Peterson. In that interview, Davis described a conversation he said he had with Cooper after Lacambria disappeared. According to Davis, he noticed dark material inside Cooper's vehicle and asked about it. Davis told investigators that Cooper gave an explanation. He said Cooper told him it was brain matter on the roof of the car. That statement was not a laboratory conclusion. No forensic scientist took the stand and told the jury that material on the roof had been scientifically identified as brain tissue. It was Davis's account of what Cooper allegedly told him. And that difference mattered. But so did the fact that the statement existed at all. Davis also told investigators that he believed Cooper had shot Lacambria. Again, that was Davis's belief, not an eyewitness account of the killing. He had not testified that he stood there and watched Cooper shoot her. No one did. The prosecution still had to build its case without an eyewitness to Lacambria's death. But investigators were beginning to collect pieces that seemed, to them, to point in the same direction. Cooper said he left Lacambria in Cordell. Police said the phone evidence contradicted that story. Cooper said he called her afterward. Investigators said the phone records did not show that call. Lacambria's phone stopped communicating. Her body was never found, and suspected blood-carrying DNA, consistent with Lacambria's family line, was found inside Cooper's Audi. Then came Davis's account of what Cooper allegedly said about the material inside that same car. Still, suspicion is not a conviction. And in America, even a deeply suspicious set of circumstances must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt before a jury can convict someone of murder. Investigators needed to keep building. On May 31, 2023, about 9 months after Lacambria disappeared, authorities arrested Ryan Cooper. Contemporary reporting described the arrest as being on murder charges, but the legal path that followed was not simple or fast. There was still no body. And despite the arrest, a formal murder indictment in the Toomer case would not arrive for nearly 3 more years. That delay left Lacambria's family in an agonizing position. They knew investigators were looking closely at Cooper. They knew evidence had been collected. They knew police no longer seemed to be treating Lacambria's disappearance as though she might simply have chosen to leave. But they still did not know where she was. And they still did not have a murder trial. In August 2025, 3 years after Lacambria disappeared, her mother was still publicly asking for answers. By then, Lacambria's son was no longer the 6-month-old baby he had been when his mother vanished. Time was moving for everyone, except the missing woman at the center of the case. Her mother said she still had no closure. She could not bury her daughter. She could not visit a grave. 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 Answer Lorgens normally gets to answer. Where is she? That question had never gone away. And while Lacambria's mother kept searching for her daughter, prosecutors were preparing to ask a different question. Could they prove a murder, even if they never found Lacambria's body? In March 2026, nearly 4 years after the disappearance, a Dougherty County grand jury formally indicted Ryan Cooper in connection with Lacambria's death. The charges included malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, possession of a firearm during the commission of a crime, and concealing the death of another person. By the time the case reached trial, additional counts presented to the jury included 2 felony murder counts and aggravated battery. Cooper pleaded not guilty and maintained his innocence. The prosecution now faced one of the most difficult kinds of murder cases to present: a no-body case. The phrase sounds simple. The problem is not. Without a body, prosecutors first have to convince jurors of something most murder trials begin by taking for granted: that the alleged victim is dead. Then they have to prove how that person died. And then they have to prove who was criminally responsible. 3 enormous questions. And in Lacambria's case, prosecutors had to answer all 3 without ever placing her remains in front of the jury. The trial began in July 2026 in Dougherty County. From the beginning, prosecutors made clear that they would not rely on one dramatic piece of evidence. They planned to build the case piece by piece. The history between Lacambria and Cooper. The final known movements. The phone records. The GPS information. The Audi. The suspected blood, the DNA, the testimony of people who knew them, and finally, experts who would attempt to reconstruct what the physical evidence meant. The defense had a simpler target: reasonable doubt. If prosecutors could not produce Lacambria's body, then every conclusion about how she died had to come from indirect evidence. Defense attorney Benjamin Davis argued that the state had not proven its story beyond a reasonable doubt. He attacked the forensic work. He questioned the differences between the blood testing. He challenged the experts. And he argued that prosecutors had constructed a theory rather than established a fact. That was the battle the jury had to watch unfold. Not a question of whether Lacambria was missing. Everyone knew she was. Not a question of whether Cooper had been with her. The evidence placed them together. The question was whether the state could move from those facts to murder. The prosecution began by taking jurors backward. Witnesses described earlier alleged domestic incidents between Lacambria and Cooper. The beauty salon owner returned to the moment when Lacambria had banged on her locked door, asking to be allowed inside. Lacambria's mother testified. Other witnesses described conflict in the relationship. The state wanted the jury to see those events as context for what prosecutors believed happened in August 2022. But the judge had also been asked to make an important decision before the trial began. Prosecutors had sought to combine the murder case with a separate aggravated assault case involving Lacambria. Judge Denise Marshall denied that motion. So the jurors still had to decide the murder charges based on the evidence properly presented in the case before them. Then came the disappearance timeline. Investigators described Cooper's courtly account. The argument he said happened during the trip, the Love's truck stop, the claimed phone call afterward, and the records that investigators said did not support it. Then the jury heard about Lacambria's phone, its final communication, its location data, the truck lot on Centennial Avenue in Albany, a place that did not fit neatly with Cooper's claim that he had already left Lacambria in Cordele. The state was building a contradiction. But contradiction alone was not enough. Then prosecutors turned to the car. Parts of Cooper's Audi were physically brought before the jury. The vehicle itself no longer existed in complete form by the time some experts became involved. That would become important later. But jurors could see pieces that investigators had preserved. Craig Bilsby, who had worked with Albany police, testified about the forensic processing. He described presumptive testing that indicated blood on some pieces from the Audi. He also told the jury about an unusual experiment investigators had performed. The passenger seat had appeared heavily saturated, so investigators wanted to understand how much blood might be required to produce that level of saturation. Bilsby testified that he was advised to conduct a comparison using horse blood and the same type of vehicle seat. The purpose was not to recreate Lacambria's death, it was to examine saturation. According to Bilsby, the seat from Cooper's Audi appeared even more saturated than the seat used in the controlled experiment. For prosecutors, the amount mattered. Because if a large quantity of Lacambria's blood had soaked into that passenger seat, the state could argue that this was not evidence of a minor injury. The defense attacked the methodology. A presumptive blood test is not the same thing as final DNA identification. And an experiment using animal blood cannot tell a jury exactly what happened to a human being. The defense pressed those weaknesses. Then came the GBI. Forensic testing focused on DNA taken from the suspected blood evidence. GBI forensic scientist Bianca Folks testified that DNA analysis was consistent with the biological child of Lacambria's mother. That conclusion helped prosecutors identify Lacambria as the person whose blood they believed was inside the Audi. But again, the defense challenged the details. Why did some results differ between Albany police testing and GBI testing? What exactly had been tested? Which tests were presumptive? Which were confirmatory? How much could the jury safely conclude? The defense did not have to prove that Lacambria's blood was somewhere else. It only had to persuade at least one juror that the prosecution had not eliminated reasonable doubt. And there was another problem for the state. Even if the jury accepted that Lacambria's blood was inside the car, blood alone does not automatically prove murder. People bleed for many reasons. An injury, an accident, an assault that is not fatal. The prosecution needed to show that what happened inside the Audi could not reasonably be explained by a survivable event. For that, they turned to reconstruction. Rod Englert was called as a crime scene reconstruction expert. He studied the bloodstain evidence associated with the Audi, the headliner, the passenger seat cushion, the center console. He considered photographs and the evidence investigators had preserved. Then he gave the jury his opinion. Englert concluded that Lacambria had been shot while she was in the passenger seat, and that the shot came from the driver's side. According to his reconstruction, the blood patterns were consistent with backspatter from a head wound. He believed the person in the driver's seat fired the shot. And he believed Lacambria then collapsed across the center console and bled. It was one of the prosecution's most important moments. For the first time, the jury was being given a physical reconstruction of how the state believed Lacambria died. Not simply that something happened in the Audi. Not simply that she bled there. but that she had been fatally shot while sitting inside it. Yet even this testimony had a limitation. Englert had never examined the complete Audi. By the time he became involved, the vehicle had been destroyed. The defense made sure the jury heard that. How could an expert confidently reconstruct a shooting inside a vehicle he had never examined while it was intact? Englert acknowledged the limitation. His opinion was based on the evidence, photographs, and preserved material available to him. The jurors had to decide how much weight to give it. Then prosecutors called Dr. James Downs, a medical legal consultant. His task went to the heart of the no-body problem. Was Lacambria dead? Downs had never examined her body. No one could. Her remains had never been recovered. He could not perform an autopsy. He could not give the jury the exact path of a bullet through her head. He could not identify a precise caliber. He could not point to an entrance wound on a body. What he could examine was the evidence investigators said had come from inside the Audi, and the amount of blood became critical. Downs told the jury that, in his opinion, the volume of blood represented by the evidence was too great for Lacambria to have survived. He estimated that more than half of the blood volume expected in a person her size had been lost. His conclusion was direct. He believed Lacambria was dead, and based on the bloodstain evidence, he believed she had suffered a gunshot injury to the head. The defense pushed him on exactly what he could and could not know. Could he identify the caliber? No. Could he give the exact location of the wound, beyond the general area? No. Why not? Because there was no body. That answer captured the entire case. The prosecution had evidence, but there were things the missing body made impossible to know with ordinary medical certainty. No autopsy, no recovered projectile from Lacambria, no examination of her remains. No opportunity for the defense to hire another pathologist to inspect the same body and offer a competing interpretation. The jury had to decide whether those missing pieces created reasonable doubt or whether the evidence that remained was strong enough without them. And then there was Tevin Davis, Cooper's longtime friend. His testimony became one of the most closely watched parts of the trial. At first, parts of Davis's testimony were difficult. His memory became an issue. At one point, proceedings involving him went into a closed session so his memory could be refreshed. Then Davis returned, and the jury heard more. They heard the police interview, in which Davis had described asking Cooper about Lacambria. They heard that Davis said Cooper had told him about what he described as brain matter on the roof of the Audi. They heard Davis describe the relationship between Cooper and Lacambria as toxic, and they heard his belief that Cooper had shot her. But prosecutors had to be careful. Davis had not witnessed Lacambria's killing. His statements could support the state's theory. They could not magically turn him into an eyewitness. The case remained circumstantial. Phone data, blood evidence, DNA, witness testimony, a disputed account from Cooper, expert reconstruction, and the disappearance of a woman who had never resurfaced. No bank account activity or public appearance had brought Lacambria back into the world. No verified phone call had come from her. Her mother had spent years begging for information. Her young son was growing up without her. And throughout the trial, one fact remained unchanged. Nobody could tell the jury where Lacambria's body was. The state rested its case. Then Judge Marshall addressed Cooper. He had a constitutional right to testify. He also had a constitutional right not to. The decision belonged to him. Ryan Cooper chose not to take the witness stand. His attorneys rested without asking the jury to hear his version directly from him in court. That decision could not legally be treated as evidence of guilt. The burden remained entirely on the prosecution. Now there were no more witnesses left to call. No surprise body had been discovered. No last-minute confession had appeared. No eyewitness was waiting outside the courtroom. Everything the jury would use to decide Ryan Cooper's future was already in front of them. The state had one final chance to explain what all those pieces meant. The defense had one final chance to tear that explanation apart. And somewhere outside that courtroom, after nearly 4 years of searching, Lacambria Toomer was still missing. The next morning, both sides would stand before the jury and tell them two completely different stories about the same evidence. One side would say the blood, the phone records, and the Audi proved murder. The other would say the state had built a story around a woman it could not even prove through a body, was dead. Then 12 jurors would leave the courtroom to decide which version they believed. No one yet knew how long that decision would take. No one yet knew how long that decision would take. 24 minutes. That was how long the jury needed. But before those 24 minutes, both sides had one final opportunity to tell jurors what they believed the evidence meant. On July 14, 2026, prosecutors returned to the same pieces they had spent the trial assembling. Lacambria's disappearance. Her final phone activity. Ryan Cooper's account of leaving her at a Love's truck stop in Cordell. The phone records investigators said did not show the call Cooper claimed to have made afterward. The location data placing Lacambria's phone back in Albany. The blood evidence inside Cooper's Audi. The DNA testing. The testimony about the amount of blood. And the reconstruction expert's conclusion that Lacambria had been shot while sitting in the passenger seat. There was still no body. The prosecution did not pretend otherwise. They could not show the jury an autopsy. They could not point to Lacambria's remains. They could not tell her mother where her daughter had been taken after the killing. What prosecutors argued was that someone should not be able to escape responsibility for murder simply because the victim's body had been successfully concealed. District Attorney Greg Edwards told jurors that the evidence, taken together, proved Ryan Cooper was responsible. The defense saw something completely different. Benjamin Davis told the jury that the state had not met its burden. There was no body, no eyewitness to the killing, no confession from Cooper. And the defense had spent days challenging the forensic evidence that prosecutors relied upon. The two sides had looked at the same car, the same phone records, the same witnesses, and the same missing woman. And they had reached opposite conclusions. That is what juries are for. Not to decide which story is more dramatic, not to decide which attorney speaks more forcefully, but to determine whether the prosecution has proven every required element beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge instructed the jury. Then the jurors left to deliberate. For Lacambria's family, almost 4 years had already passed since the first days of searching. Years of photographs, years of public appeals, years of asking strangers for information, years of going back to the same question. Where is Lacambria? Now another question was about to be answered. What would 12 jurors decide about the man prosecutors said had killed her? 24 minutes after deliberations began, the jury had a verdict. They returned to the courtroom. Ryan Cooper stood as the decisions were read. Malice murder. Guilty. Felony murder. Guilty. Another felony murder count. Guilty. Aggravated assault. Guilty. Aggravated assault. Guilty. Firearm charges. Guilty. Concealing the death of another. Guilty. Every count submitted to the jury came back guilty. For the legal system, something enormous had just changed. Lacambria Toomer was no longer only the subject of a missing person investigation. A jury had concluded beyond a reasonable doubt that she had been murdered, and Ryan Cooper had been convicted of doing it. But for Lacambria's mother, the verdict carried a truth she had spent years hoping she would never have to accept. Her daughter was not coming home alive. After the verdict, Malacia Thornton spoke about what the decision meant. There was relief that someone had finally been held accountable, but there was still no closure. Because the verdict answered one question. It did not answer the question she had been asking from the beginning. Where was her daughter? Thornton said the reality of Lacambria's death had finally set in. She still wanted her child back. And even after the jury declared Cooper guilty, she still hoped he might tell her where Lacambria was. He did not. The prosecution acknowledged the same unfinished reality. Assistant District Attorney Tracy Mullis praised the investigative work that had brought the case to trial. But she also said there was something Lacambria's mother still deserved. The location of her daughter. That was the strange divide at the end of the trial. The state had proven enough to convict a man of murder, but it still could not bring the victim home. Even District Attorney Edwards spoke afterward about what the case represented. A murder prosecution without a recovered body is unusual. And this case directly challenged the idea that hiding a victim's remains can make a murder impossible to prove. The jury had been given no body. They had been given evidence. And in 24 minutes, they decided that evidence was enough. But a conviction is not the same thing as a funeral. It cannot replace a burial. It cannot tell a child where his mother is. And it cannot give a family a place to go when they want to be close to the person they lost. For the investigators, that meant the work was not finished. Lacambria still had to be found. The day after the verdict, the question surrounding the case was no longer whether Ryan Cooper would be convicted. It was whether the person who now stood convicted would finally reveal where Lacambria's remains were. There was no indication that he did, and so the search continued. For Lacambria's mother, the years before the verdict had already demanded things no parent expects to do. She had organized searches. She had spoken publicly again and again. She had pleaded for tips. She had held vigils. She had entered wooded areas looking for her daughter. She had gone near water. She had asked people she did not know to help. And through those years, she was also caring for Lacambria's son. The baby who had been only months old when his mother disappeared was growing up. That child became one of the quietest but most painful parts of the case. He had lost his mother, and the person convicted of killing her was his father. Lacambria's mother was now raising him. A grandmother carrying her own grief while helping raise a child who would eventually have questions about both of his parents. Questions that no court verdict could completely answer. 3 weeks after Cooper was convicted, the case returned to a Dougherty County courtroom. August 7, 2026. Sentencing day. Ryan Cooper was now 28 years old. He was no longer standing before the court as a defendant presumed innocent. A jury had convicted him. Now Judge Denise Marshall had to determine the punishment. Before she did, Lacambria's mother was given an opportunity to speak. For years, Thornton had addressed television cameras, members of the public, investigators, and anyone who might know something. This time, she addressed the man convicted of killing her daughter. Her request had not changed. She wanted Lacambria back. Not an explanation of the phone records. Not another argument over the Audi. Not another forensic opinion. She wanted to know where her daughter's body was. Thornton told Cooper that she deserved the opportunity to lay Lacambria to rest. And she reminded the court that Lacambria and Cooper's son deserved answers too. Then she asked him directly, "Please tell me where my baby is." Cooper did not provide the location. That meant even at the moment when the criminal case was reaching its final punishment, the oldest question in the case remained unanswered. Where had Lacambria been taken? Judge Marshall then addressed Cooper. She had presided over a trial containing evidence she later described as extremely difficult to hear. And when it came time to impose sentence, Marshall made clear that what she was about to do was unusual in her own career. "I've never sentenced anybody to life without the possibility of parole." Then she did. Ryan Cooper was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence meant that, unless his conviction or sentence is overturned through the legal process, Cooper will spend the rest of his life in prison. His defense continued to maintain his innocence, and Judge Marshall said she expected the defense to pursue a request for a new trial. That legal process could continue, but the jury's decision remained. Ryan Cooper had been convicted of murdering Lacambria Toomer, and the court had sentenced him to life without parole. For Thornton, the sentence did not end the search. She told reporters she would continue raising her grandson. She described a little boy who recognizes photographs of his mother. A child who can look at those photographs and identify her. A child who asks where she is. Those questions will become harder as he grows older. Because one day, he will be old enough to understand the full story. His mother disappeared when he was an infant. For years, his grandmother searched for her. His father denied responsibility. Investigators searched locations connected to phone data and found nothing. Police examined a car. Forensic scientists tested what investigators recovered from it. Experts reconstructed what they believed happened inside. A jury listened to all of it. And nearly 4 years after Lacambria disappeared, that jury convicted his father of killing his mother. But they still could not tell him where she was. That remains the unfinished part of Lacambria Toomer's story. Investigators have said the search for her remains will continue. Lieutenant Calandria Peterson, whose investigation became central to the prosecution, said authorities would keep searching until they could bring Lacambria home and give her family the chance for a proper burial. That matters because a conviction can close a criminal prosecution. It does not automatically close a family's grief. The law can say who is responsible. It can impose punishment. It can put someone behind bars for life, but it cannot replace what was taken. For years, Lacambria's mother had lived with uncertainty. At first, she could still hope her daughter might walk through the door. She could publicly ask Lacambria to call home. She could tell her she was loved. She could tell her that her baby missed her. Then the investigation changed. The evidence changed what authorities believed. And eventually, a jury made that change permanent in the eyes of the law. The verdict gave Thornton justice. But it also forced her to confront what that justice meant. The daughter she had been searching for was now legally recognized as the victim of a murder. And the man convicted of killing her still had not told anyone where her remains were. There is something especially painful about that kind of ending. Not because we need to invent what happened after the killing. We do not know. The evidence did not establish exactly where Cooper took Lacambria's body. It did not establish precisely how he concealed her remains. And there is no verified public record explaining where she is today. Those gaps should remain gaps. Because they are the same gaps her family is living with. What is known is enough. Lacambria Toomer was 23 years old. She was a daughter, a great-granddaughter, and the mother of an infant son. Her family said disappearing without contact was not normal for her. Her final known period of activity in August 2022 placed her with the father of her child. Ryan Cooper later told investigators that he had left her at a truck stop in Cordell. Investigators said the phone evidence did not support that account. Her phone's last known ping came from Albany. Police found blood evidence inside Cooper's Audi. DNA testing tied that evidence to Lacambria's family line. A crime scene reconstruction expert testified that the patterns were consistent with Lacambria being shot while sitting in the passenger seat. A medical consultant testified that the amount of blood loss was incompatible with survival. Cooper's longtime friend told investigators about a disturbing statement he said Cooper had made concerning material inside the vehicle. The defense challenged the forensic testing and argued that the state had failed to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury disagreed. On July 14, 2026, after 24 minutes of deliberation, Ryan Cooper was found guilty on every count presented to them. On August 7th, he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And Lacambria is still missing. That final fact is why this story does not end at the prison door. Somewhere, there may still be evidence that can bring a mother back to her family. There may still be someone who knows something. There may still be a place investigators have not searched. For Lacambria's family, finding her is no longer about proving what happened in court. That part has been decided. It is about dignity. It is about bringing her home. It is about allowing a mother to lay her daughter to rest. And it is about giving Lacambria's son something every child deserves when someone they love is gone. A place to remember them. The court could punish Ryan Cooper. It could not make him answer the question Lacambria's mother asked him. So that question remains. Where is Lacambria Toomer? Until she is found, her family's search is not over. And neither should her name be forgotten. If you value true crime stories that stay with the facts, respect the victims, and follow the evidence wherever it leads, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. And above everything else, remember the person at the center of this one. Her name was Lacambria Toomer.